Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Today we're talking about essentially the latest event where unprovoked and indiscriminate firing by Indian troops across the line of control has once again risen the kind of tensions that have existed between India and Pakistan, especially since August 5th, since the abrogation of Article 370 that gave Jammu and Kashmir somewhat of an autonomy. This was done, of course, by the BJP-led government. Now, what we're seeing is that the Pakistani government on this occasion also has summoned the Indian Charge d'Affaires, Mr. Gaurav Ahluwalia, to register the protest that Pakistan government has done on several occasions in the past, especially if we're just to look at since January 2024, separate such protests were registered by the Pakistani government, talking about how this was a violation of not just international law and international human rights, but more essentially the 2003 ceasefire agreement between the two countries. Now, dozens have been injured because of this unprovoked and indiscriminate firing that has been occurring more so, especially since the abrogation of Article 370. But if we're talking about 2019 also, we had 3,000 such unprovoked firing across the LOC by the Indian troops, and that had resulted in 59 civilians in Azad Kashmir losing their lives. And these are innocent civilians, and we've seen this time and again that civilian population areas are targeted, unprovoked firing takes place. Now, while this is unfolding, we also want to highlight that today in Jammu and Kashmir, it is being observed a complete strike. What is being observed? Let me tell you a little about what is unfolding there. Pro-freedom leaders and organizations, they're observing the 36th death anniversary of a prominent Kashmiri separatist leader, that is Mohammad Maqbool Bhatt, who was hanged by the Indian authorities in 1984 in Delhi's Tihar jail. Now, he was also the founder of the National Liberation Front. Now, we will be talking about this, also highlighting what is unfolding within India's borders. The anti-CAA protests still going strong 3 months later. So a lot coming up in the show. Let me introduce who we have. In our Lahore studios, we are joined by Lieutenant General Ashraf Saleem. He's an analyst. Welcome to the show. Lieutenant General, right off the bat, let's talk about these LOC violations. They take place now more often than we can keep a track of. Just from January 2020, we are seeing so many innocent lives lost. Pakistan has continued to bring this conversation to the World Forum, but nothing seems to be moving on that front.
Yeah, that's the issue. Ceasefire violations is not something new to Pakistan or to India, because right from 1948 onwards, it has been going on. We have been firing across each other, across the LOC onto each other, and previously they were restricted to small arms firing most of the time, not more than a rifle or maybe a machine gun, just about what we call in terms of caliber, 7.62 mm caliber. That was the maximum. Beyond that, it used to be a restricted fire. We would, at the most, resort to 12.7 millimeter firing. Mortar firing and artillery gun firing was very rare. And this thing continued till about 2003, when there was a ceasefire agreement between Pakistan and India. And it was decided that if there is something to be discussed, there was a hotlines established between the DGMOs on both sides. And whenever there was an incident, they could talk to each other, they could resolve the issue. And whenever a ceasefire violation takes place, every time we registered the ceasefire violation with the UN observers on our side.
Right.
But on the Indian side, they're not there. They have confined their movements, they have confined them to certain areas. They don't allow them to go and investigate if there is a ceasefire violation. On our side, we do allow them. They go on the site, they investigate, and they submit the report to their office in UN. Now, 2003 onwards, there was a sort of a calm across the LOC till about 2011, where certain incidents took place and this kind of firing restarted. Recently, as you very aptly mentioned in your introduction, that recently after this CA thing going on, and Indian Muslims and some of the Indian population, other than Muslims, they are also protesting against the kind of act their parliament has passed, in which the Muslims have been discriminated against particularly. And just to keep that kind of attention of the public, attention of their own public and international fora away from those kinds of happenings, they are resorting more and more.
So it's a distraction tactic.
Yeah, one that it's a sort of a tactics where they can distract the attention of the public, their own public, international media.
And maybe pose it like as if they're the ones who are the victims here, right? Now, just hold that thought. Let me bring in another voice to this conversation. We're joined by Mr. Rajiv Desai, is an analyst joining us from Delhi. Welcome, Mr. Desai. This conversation, we're starting here from the LOC ceasefire violations. They continue, Pakistan continues to register protests. The argument at the moment is pegged on whether this is a distraction purpose from what is unfolding within India, the kind of lockdown Jammu and Kashmir is seeing. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I've always said that it is a distraction tactic. And this is a government that's been in power for 6 years and have nothing to show by way of policy, foreign policy or economic development. They have absolutely nothing to show. So this is one way to divert attention. The other way, of course, they're pursuing Mad Hatter issues like CAA and so forth. And now, you know, it's all coming crashing down on them because, as you know, we are sitting here in Delhi to see them have been completely crushed in the landslide of the AAP party. And they did everything under the sun to polarize the electorate along Hindu-Muslim lines. But it didn't work, and I don't think that the number of seats is going to exceed more than single digits, and they're completely and just so you understand this, the main party that the Congress, which has ruled Delhi for 15 years from the 1900s to the 2000s, they stayed out of the race virtually just to ensure that the BJP is defeated. So it's that kind of a consensus is building that these guys have to be stopped any which way. And and everybody always thinks that in the last rush that they will create an incident at the border.
Right. Now, you've touched on a very key issue here, polarization, something that BJP has very effectively used in winning seats, in winning their second tenure also. But what we're seeing unfolding here in the Delhi elections, the Aam Aadmi Party leading quite impressively. I mean, the final results are still to be announced, but so far the count is that polarization of the BJP government, as they used it for a voter turnout tactic, really backfiring internationally also with what India's impression has become?
Well, of course, it's backfired on them. He had managed, Mr. Modi had managed to create this impression that he was a economic reforms messiah, and you know, under him the Indian economy will be freed and foreign investment will be welcome. None of that happened. Not only that, no investor worth his salt would ever come to India, considering the situation, what they did in Kashmir and elsewhere. So they're lost over there, and certainly the world sees that they're called a Hindu nationalist party all around the world. You know, nobody minces any words there. So yes, I think it's fairly obvious to the world that these people are out to generate electoral gains from dividing the Indian population is on its most severe fault line, which is the Hindu-Muslim fault line, which is how there was partition and so forth. And so this is the button they keep pressing.
Now, what we're seeing, Lieutenant General, also, we will come back to what is unfolding within India in terms of anti-CAA protests, but not just within India. In fact, in Europe, we've seen protests in the past few days in front of the Indian embassy in Vienna and elsewhere. We're seeing a lot of people talk about Kashmir solidarity in these protests. Pakistan's narrative has constantly been to push in terms of sensitize the world leaders on what is unfolding. It's 191 days since the lockdown. Now, you've been the High Commissioner of Nigeria, as you just mentioned earlier before the show. Tell me, how does the bureaucratic system work here? I mean, with these protests being registered against the LOC violations, with the Kashmir narrative being pushed, is there any traction that the Jammu and Kashmir issue is getting?
I think not that much as we would like it to be, but certainly the world intelligentsia and all the people who are supposed to be moved by this kind of these kind of protests, there is a bit of impact, like Mr. Desai mentioned that the investment earlier on going into India, that has been retarded quite a bit, and I think it will ultimately have the impact. But right now, I don't see too much of impact on India, because particularly on BJP, because Indian intelligentsia, Indian media, I think they are highlighting this kind of thing. But BJP is not moved. Somehow, they are still sticking to their old policy, and they're making it more anti-Pakistan. Everything is redirected towards Pakistan. See, that's the kind of attitude which is damaging the overall environment within the subcontinent.
Right.
I mean, you see, even SARC has failed here. So far, it's a failing organization, well, because India didn't allow it to move further. So I don't see that kind of impact on the international level so far,
right,
which we would like it to be that way, and then ultimately which must lead towards the resolution of Kashmir conflict as such.
Right.
But we need to do a lot more on that,
right,
I believe. Yeah.
Pakistan has to do a lot
Yeah,
more.
yeah.
Mr. Desai, coming back to you on this very point, the kind of sort of protest taking place even in Shaheen Bagh as the Delhi election polls continue to show Aam Aadmi Party leading, but the security forces continue to use very hardline tactics. Recent reports coming in of chemical spray being used on women protesters in Shaheen Bagh, debilitating them. They become dizzy, they faint. A lot of them are in the ICU in hospitals. Tell us about where the BJP stands on these tactics. As Lieutenant General said, are they not being moved generally by what reaction that they're provoking?
No, because as your other panelists noted, that the media are completely silent on any of this. They're not highlighting, except maybe one or two channels. By and large, nobody is even talking about this. So that's number one. Number two, I think the thing that that will eventually sort of come into play is that we already seen the failure on the economic front. Now we're seeing a failure on the foreign policy front, because going all the way back to the Simla Accord, the attempt has been to keep it as a bilateral
right,
disagreement that can be resolved or lightened with consultations between the two sides. And the resolve was never to internationalize it, at least certainly from the Indian side. And they've managed to do just that. They've managed to get Kashmir discussed in the Security Council after so many years. So it's a huge foreign policy failure on their part, looking at it from the Indian side. And you're right, they will always refer to Pakistan in order to divert attention. Their real targets are the Muslims in India. There's 200 plus million of them, and the BJP have used them, this divide very effectively to catapult themselves into power. But now they're losing out, and we're going to have to see how this plays out, because the polarization tactic is clearly not working.
But Mr. Desai, the Supreme Court moved on a plea that was filed by a BJP senior leader talking about removing protesters from Shaheen Bagh, something the Supreme Court refused to do. Does that give you hope that maybe the BJP will be held accountable for the kind of ultra-right-wing policies that are hurting those 200 plus million Muslims in Indian citizens?
Well, you're right. I mean, the BJP are not being held to account. They've suborned every institution, including the Supreme Court. And by the way, the Supreme Court has only said that for the moment they're not asking them to clear the Shaheen Bagh protest, but they will look at it on the 17th of February. Now that the BJP have been spectacularly defeated, we'll have to see how they rule. But the Supreme Court is also sort of partisan in many ways, like the Election Commission, like the police, like the bureaucracy. They've suborned each and every institution of theirs. And I think the worry that we now have here in India is that even after they are gone, and they inevitably will be gone, it'll take quite some time to rejigger, refix, and spruce up all the institutions again to their impartial ways, their constitutional ways. But as of now, they've managed to divide the place quite spectacularly. Mercifully, the best thing that has happened is, for the first time that we can recall, the Muslim community has spoken up, and they've spoken up in a peaceful manner of protest, using Gandhian tactics of satyagraha, sitting in demand of their
Peaceful
to
protest.
demand their rights and so forth. Yeah, so this is all to the good. They've also refocused everybody's attention to the Constitution, which is also to the good. Kids now, schools are now having a deal where kids have to recite the preamble to the Constitution in mornings. So in that way, it's to the good. The only trouble is that we have no legitimate way, like the United States, of impeachment or anything to get these guys out.
Right.
So we somehow have to just try and deal with the situation and try and make sure that they don't damage it too much.
You talk about a silver there, Mr. Desai, which is really good, and also sort of the core issue here is that the Muslims of India, but not just the Muslims, a lot of people from different walks of life, in general, are coming together to speak up on this and to back the Constitution of India, which is very secular in its nature. Now, meanwhile, let's reflect a little on what is unfolding in Jammu and Kashmir. There are 8 million people who've been under siege, complete curfew, complete communication lockdown. In fact, even the political leadership has been rendered useless, being put behind bars. Recently, we saw the former Chief Minister's sister take a plea to the Supreme Court, contesting that when he's already under has been detained under the PSA, the Controversial Public Safety Act, it does not make sense that he should be further detained. Now, tell us a little about how this in long term affects the voice from Kashmir of the people in terms of fighting for their rights or speaking up, because there's absolutely no way to have any representation from there.
I think the people of Kashmir are being misread by Indians, particularly by the BJP. Why? Because they think that this way, by using oppressive tactics, keeping them locked up like that, and trying to suppress their voices, this way probably they will break their resolve for independence. I don't think so that this can happen. Why? Because Kashmiris have been fighting for their freedom struggle. They have been continuing it for the last so many years. And I don't think it'll have that kind of effect that India will be able to subjugate them forever. Right now, the only thing which goes in favor of BJP is that even within India, the civil society and rest of the forces which should have come to the rescue of the Kashmiris at this moment, and especially with the kind of CA protest going on, I think India should have been worried. Why? Because it's a particular community. Muslims as such as a community are being targeted. And this will also, in a way, affect boost the resolve of Kashmiris also to a great extent. And it's a question of time. I don't think they can suppress these voices. Kashmiris will continue with this struggle. International environment, somehow, it has favored BJP that way, because the kind of Cold War, I would say, going on between USA and China,
right,
and the environment which is being reshaped inside the Middle East, this has gone into Indians' favor, BJP's favor, I would say, because the Western media is not coming that heavily onto BJP.
Right.
That's why BJP is still standing to their own whatever the initial stand, they're still continuing with that.
Right.
Otherwise, I think the international media should have come up very heavily onto BJP because BJP itself, I think they are doing a lot of damage to India.
Right.
Pakistan
a lot of
doesn't
self-damage
have,
also. A lot of self-damage also with the kind of policies they're pushing. But just on that point, Mr. Desai, is the Western world right now sort of is India out of favor with the Western world technically? Because as Prime Minister Modi prepares for President Trump's visit to India expected next month, there are already talks of huge billion-dollar deals being signed, of military equipment with Lockheed Martin itself. 3 big defense purchases have taken place, whether we're talking about helicopters or drones. Is this in preparation of sort of gaining back favor, and will it succeed?
Okay, no. Mr. Modi seeks invitations into the parlors of Western leaders by using his Government of India checkbook to buy weapons from them. And which Western leader is not pleased to sell weapons to them, because it means so many things to them, including employment. So Mr. Modi is being blessed by a visit of Donald Trump, largely because he's going to buy this, he's done this deal to buy these weapons. Earlier on, when he went to the United States, he signed a weapons deal, so they let him address a joint session of Congress, and on and on. So, you know, he goes with this, with his checkbook and our tax dollars to buy himself credibility and legitimacy in Western parlors and so forth. So, yeah, this is the only reason the Westerners look at him is because he'll buy stuff. As far as the media are concerned, I think there's been a fair amount of criticism in mainstream newspapers in the United States. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, all the major newspapers, and including some CNN, and have reported on this, maybe not to the extent that they should, but they've also been occupied with their own impeachment drama. But there has been significant coverage, and it has really seriously affected investment into India, because nobody's making any plans to make any investments.
Right, no, hold on, Desai. Let me welcome Mr. Babu Singh here as a former minister joining us right now from Jammu and Kashmir. Mr. Singh, my question to you is essentially, as we talk about where India, BJP government's foreign policy stands, where its local policy stands in dealing with the kind of environment it's created with this ultra-nationalist policies, let's talk about something that's not being covered at all. Jammu and Kashmir administration has recently given approval of handing over land to somewhere around 20 canals for the building of a temple there. Is this the kind of demographic change that continues in an environment where barely any news is filtering out? Tell us a little more about it, if you will.
Modi-led dispensation, the present Modi-led dispensation in India adopted both internally and externally very faulty policies. They have isolated in the international arena. They have committed so many blunders. Still, there is a stalemate with Pakistan. By passing a Citizens Amendment Act in the Parliament, they have further damaged the relations with Bangladesh, with the Afghanistan. This was not a sensible move. The whole diplomacy of present dispensation, I think, is defective and faulty.
Right, but Mr. Singh, we've been talking about how the policies by the BJP-led government has sort of caused a lot of self-immolation of the party itself. But focusing on what is not being talked about as a result of so many distractions, whether they're LOC violations by Indian troops or the way protesters are being dealt with in India, tell us about what you make of the news that Jammu and Kashmir administration hands over 20 canals of land for a temple, a Hindu temple to be built. Is this the kind of concern that Kashmiris should have of the demographic change happening there?
Definitely, they have brutally mishandled the very sensitive Jammu Kashmir, because the Jammu Kashmir is historically a very complex and a very vexed dispute. It needs a very sensible handling. But unfortunately, since 1947, all the successive governments of Delhi, they have not acted according to the basic nature of Jammu Kashmir problem or Jammu Kashmir dispute. But the present dispensation led by Modi, they have brutally mishandled, and the consequences will be very serious. And further, they have complicated the Jammu Kashmir problems. In fact, and in the whole in India, by taking a certain a communal designs and initiatives, they have spoiled the internal political and social atmosphere of India. But the people of Delhi now have given a very strong message to the Modi dispensations, and they have clear-cut message that your communal design ultimately will not be taught.
Thank you so much, Mr. Babu Singh. Picking up a very important point there, Attorney General, about whether even if the BJP government leaves, but the kind of hardened sort of policies they might have inculcated in the masses towards how they deal with Jammu and Kashmir and this 8 million civilians there who've been under siege. Are you worried that this could have a much longer term impact?
I think I shouldn't be worried, rather I should be happy with that, because India ultimately has to give the right of self-determination to the people of Kashmir. Now, the more oppressive they become, the more resolve the Kashmiri freedom movement will have. And it's not a question of the next government after post-BJP government dealing with Kashmiris that way. I think the Kashmiri struggle is very close to its culmination, and Kashmiris will have their own right for their own state, or whatever they are joining with Pakistan, whatever the choice they have.
Right.
And I don't think they can deal with this, neither BJP nor the next government.
Right, but at the expense of what, right? Because at the expense of possibly a complete out war between India and Pakistan, do nuclear armed states, as we are seeing BJP continuing with its distractory tactics?
I don't think they can really go for an overt sort of a war with Pakistan. They can continue with these kind of violations, and maybe if they make the mistake of attacking the kind of threats we are getting from the Indian side, they're going to attack Azad Kashmir. You see, it's not easy to do that. If it was so easy, they would have done it by now.
They would have done it by now.
Yeah,
so it's saber rattling, basically.
They do understand Pakistani response.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time there. Attorney General, thank you so much for joining us here in the studios. With this, we'll take a quick short break. When we're back, we'll talk about the parliamentary elections about to take place in Iran. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, parliamentary elections in Iran will take place on February 21st this year. All 290 seats are up for grabs in the unicameral Majlis. Now, parliamentary elections, they take place every 4 years. A year after the vote, presidential elections take place, the win for which largely depends on who secures the majority of the votes in the parliamentary elections. Now, these current polls are coming at a pretty critical time when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran's nuclear deal that it co-signed with US and 5 other major world powers back in 2015 to curtail Iran's nuclear ambitions in exchange for relief from sanctions and more, is seen to be fast unraveling. Now, ever since President Trump withdrew from it in 2018 and he imposed his maximum pressure campaign, Iran's economy has been reeling. The rial is plummeting, and more recently, civilian unrest is further destabilizing the Middle Eastern country. So who wins the parliamentary elections essentially determines also the fate of not just the presidency, but essentially the fate of the JCPOA. That is, if it will be revived. With the current scenario, Western diplomats and analysts are concerned that Iran's Guardian Council, a 12-strong body of lawyers and religious leaders appointed indirectly by Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, are carrying out a reformist purge. That is, disqualifying candidates who might be in favor of structural reforms that would give elected bodies like the Majlis a greater role in governance and enhance their democratic accountability in Iran. Let's find out what our guests think. We have with us Mr. George Szamuely, Middle East expert, joining us from Budapest today. And from Natanz, Iran, we have Mr. Hamid Gholamzadeh, an analyst, joining us. Welcome to both of you to the show. Mr. Szamuely, Western diplomats have talked a lot in recent days about the kind of purge, as they're calling, of reformists, a political faction that is more open to the idea of accountability of the government, to structural reform, and essentially maybe the last glimmer of hope for the JCPOA. Are those concerns warranted?
Well, the JCPOA is indeed on its last legs, and that doesn't have anything to do with the upcoming elections. It's on its last legs because when the United States walked out of the JCPOA in May 2018, the European powers failed to live up to their commitments. Their commitments were that they would pick up the slack, make sure that Iran stays within the agreement by ensuring that it is able to continue to do business with the rest of the world, that it's able to sell its oil and buy goods on the world market. That the European powers failed to do. And despite repeated warnings from Tehran that step by step Iran will withdraw from this agreement, the Europeans have done nothing. And at this moment, the EU three powers are promising to invoke the dispute resolution mechanism, whereby in a gradual process, the United Nations sanctions will snap back in place. So as things stand, there is really very little chance of the JCPOA being revived. And this really has little to do with whatever the outcome of these elections.
Okay, so Mr. Gholam, the same question to you. Do you agree with Mr. Szamuely that irrespective of the way these elections are going to take place, because there are concerns being raised that the Guardian Council is being very biased towards those who might have might have any criticism how Iran has handled the JCPOA, the US-Iran tensions, that it is irrelevant at this point because the JCPOA in itself is pretty much got its legs hanging in the grave?
You know, the main problem is that the understanding of the situation in Iran is not clear and correct. Actually, it's not accurate. Because of the mainstream media depicting Iranian politics in a way that it best fits their own interest. The bias of a Guardian Council is not something true. And all the media hype that exists about the reformists being purged from the election and such things is not actually very accurate, because all the discussion is mainly about Tehran, the capital city, in elections, in which we have 30 seats, and there are about 2 or 3 times more than that key reformist figures approved by the Guardian Council. So they don't have any problem regarding the list that they would like to provide for Tehran parliament seats.
No, but the concerns, just on the misinterpretation, let's clarify the misinterpretation then, or the misrepresentation, as you're saying, that the media put these general elections. There have been, the High Council has claimed last month themselves that there is a bias against candidates, saying 90% of them had been debarred. Out of the 16,000 who applied to stand in elections, 9,000 have been disqualified. Is this the norm you're suggesting?
The problem is not by the Guardian Council, it's actually by the reformist camp themselves. It is actually the criticism that some key reformist strategists have had toward their own camp. The point is that they have introduced people who have had some problems in their backgrounds, who have had some legal issues, who have had some corruption charges and such things, and they naturally must be discredited by the Guardian Council. The reformists knew that, and they, despite the fact that they knew the reality that they would be discredited, they actually encouraged those people to register for the election to actually serve the agenda that they had. The reformists know that because of the misperformance of the government, President Rouhani's government, the popular acknowledgement, popular credit is not going to those who support the government. By the recent polls show that actually people are mainly supporting any idea which is against the current government in power, President Rouhani's government. So they know that they don't have any chances to win the election, and instead of losing the election, they prefer to depict it in a way that they are actually, let's say, putting it aside. They are not going to attend. They are going to show that they wanted to go there, but the Guardian Council did not allow them. And all the things that they are saying is just to hide the real issue, the real problem, that they have supported the government, which has been very weak in performance. They have had a list in Tehran in the current parliament, 10th parliament, which was terribly weak, and they couldn't do anything in the parliament in the last 4 years that they have been in power in parliament, mainly for Tehran, as I said, which is actually 30 important seats in the parliament. So to hide the weaknesses, to hide the weakness of the reformist MPs and reformist government, they are trying to actually overshadow that by saying that putting blame on Guardian Council and saying that we don't have enough people to make a list, while there are, as I said, about 2 or 3 times more than 30 seats available, people actually available to be introduced for the seats in Tehran, which is the leading one.
Right, but you talk about this, that President Rouhani might be sort of losing favor, and this is an agenda by the reformers to, gain some kind of traction, because the fear is that not just them losing in the elections, but also a lower turnout. But let's look at the situation as in terms of the protests that are taking place within Iran. The civilian unrest there has been also very sort of loud in criticizing how Iran has dealt with the US-Iran tensions. I mean, the parliamentary body, let's face it, doesn't have that kind of power to interfere when it comes to foreign policy. That power sits with the supreme leader.
That's actually what is making people angry with them, with the reformists. The current parliament is a reformist parliament, and it's not just about foreign policy. It was even about the domestic policy. It was about the economy. Just let's remember a few months ago about making the fuel much more expensive, about 3 times more than before. And it was because of the weakness of the parliament that they were not doing the job that they needed to do, and instead of that, other people needed to fix the problem, and it was to compensate the budget deficit that the government was facing. So instead of the parliament to handle the issue, the government tried to actually handle the budget deficit problem by increasing the fuel prices suddenly and sharply, and that was the reason behind the protest that we had a few months ago, and that what has actually made many people angry and discouraged many people from voting in the parliament elections.
But isn't that the concern that we're talking about? Mr. Szamuely, if I could get your thoughts on that if there have been 3 rounds of protests here in Iran ever since the withdrawal of President Trump from the JCPOA, the maximum pressure campaign. And this was the concern here, that the maximum pressure campaign will not weaken the resolve of the hardliners that are in power right now. Who are the ones benefiting from the kind of process that the Guardian Council takes forward, taking away or disbarring those who might be looking to sort of have a softer approach to President Trump's maximum pressure campaign?
No, that's absolutely right. Because if you impose the sanctions, and in a very ruthless way that the United States did that with the, with these extraterritorial reach, and then preventing Iran from just doing the very basic thing, which is to trade in its oil, then you are going to inflict hardships on the civilian population. Now, the calculation of the U.S. government is, of course, that, well, there's discontent among the civilian population. The people will rise up and overthrow the Ayatollahs, which is the United States dream for more than 40 years. But that's really not the way things work, because, in fact, once you impose these kinds of painful sanctions on Iran, once you humiliate Iran and try to impose unreasonable conditions on Iran, you are actually helping to shore up support for the government. And we could see the fact that, yes, there were riots in Iran, there were protests and so on, no question, but far more impressive were the millions and millions who turned out to express their condolences over the assassination of General Soleimani. And that showed much more clearly where Iranians really stood.
But Mr. Szamuely, if I may interject here, let's not forget that just a few days later, with the downing of the Ukrainian passenger jet, when Iran took responsibility for it, that unity fast dissipated.
Well, yeah, I mean, what can you do? I mean, if you shoot down a civilian airliner, it's understandable that people will be upset. That, however, didn't in any way endanger the government. If you really want to endanger the rule of the Ayatollahs, then you do what the United States did back in the 1970s and 80s. You pursue a policy of détente. Because if you pursue a policy of détente with Iran, that undermines the rationale of the rulers of Tehran in maintaining all their anti-American propaganda and all the whole thing of the great Satan and so on. Because if you remove the threat of the United States, this big ugly bear of the United States, then that undermines the legitimacy of the Ayatollah. If, however, you keep imposing and tightening sanctions and inflict suffering, then you're only reinforcing the position of the Ayatollahs. They say, look, we've got a powerful enemy that is seeking to destroy us. It's been trying to destroy us for 40 years. We need to crack down. We need to impose as much order as we can in order to survive. It's always been like this.
Mr. Gholamzadeh, do you agree with Mr. Szamuely there? I mean, is that how it's playing out in the favor of the supreme leader or the rule of Ayatollah Khamenei, the way he wants it to play out? Because it's coming at a huge cost, it seems, to the citizens of Iran, who are paying high price in runaway inflation and a really sort of reeling economy.
Here's the point, that the main person, the main figure behind the talks and behind the negotiations has been Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. It was him that actually allowed the negotiations, not the Iranian President Rouhani, even before that. And he has been the first person actually in looking at the last 3 decades. You can see that there have been points that in which he has mentioned that Iran is open to discussions, open to negotiations, even with the United States, if there is a mutual respect and some logic in the negotiations.
No. He specifically said if sanctions move. That's the problem. This is why the conversation doesn't move forward. Ayatollah Khamenei categorically says if sanctions are removed, we'll talk about negotiations, right? So that's why it's been dead in the water.
It's not just talking about the current situation. It was during President Khatami that Ayatollah Khamenei supported talks. It was during President Ahmadinejad that there were some talks. And it was during President Rouhani as well. So the main person behind the negotiations has been Ayatollah Khamenei. But the point is that he, as the leader of a country, he supports independence of the country. And Iran, he actually stepped back from many red lines that he set for negotiations, just in favor of the negotiation to proceed and to reach the JCPOA. And he actually gave up some red lines that he had drawn. But the point is that Iran did all the commitments that it had in the JCPOA, but the United States still withdrew from that and didn't do anything. Even during President Obama, we did not have the banking transaction sanctions removed. Iran had problems with the transactions in the financial system. So it was actually on the side of the Americans that the JCPOA is going to die right now. So even when the JCPOA was signed, Ayatollah Khamenei said that if Americans work correctly in the JCPOA, there would be grounds for further talks in other issues as well. It could be in region, it could be about other aspects as well. So he has been open to that, but unfortunately the problem is that
So Szamuely, we're running out of time, but I do want to get your closing comments on this in the last few seconds that we've got here. It still remains a concern, though, irrespective of how the JCPOA has turned out, and we've had this discussion ad nauseum on Newswire, especially who's at fault here. All the points you've both mentioned very eloquently of what Iran has continued to serve the JCPOA terms, but having the kind of elections that Iran is headed towards, how will that help in the future dealings with whether it's the US or other world leaders for Iran?
Well, I'm not sure that it will. I mean, the only thing that can help at this stage is something dramatic would happen following the November elections in the United States. Now, either President Trump is reelected, and maybe he will then decide that he doesn't need the Jewish lobby as before, but rather the Israel lobby. Right. He doesn't need the evangelicals as much as before, and therefore he can actually make some concessions toward Iran. Or it could be that the Democrats win, and they might want to restore the status quo ante under Obama. I think that's much less likely. But I think that's the key event to look to rather than the parliamentary elections in Iran. I think it's the United States presidential election and what happens subsequently.
All right, Mr. Szamuely, Gholamzadeh, thank you so much for joining us here on a very interesting debate about whether or not the parliamentary elections expected in a few days this month in Iran will have the kind of negative effect on a rapidly unraveling JCPOA. Well, that's all the time we have. We'll see you tomorrow with a new episode of Newswire. Till then, goodbye.